Jake Miller stepped off the transport shuttle and looked around at the most impressive space station he had ever seen. Kepler-7 stretched out in every direction, its gleaming metal corridors filled with beings from across the galaxy. He adjusted his worn backpack and checked the address on his tablet one more time. The Galactic Engineering Academy was somewhere in this maze of alien technology. A group of students walked past him, their skin shimmering blue-green in the artificial light. They carried sleek devices that hummed with energy, tools that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. Jake looked down at his own gear. His backpack was made of tough canvas, patched in several places. His tools were metal and plastic, the kind his grandfather had taught him to use back on Earth. "Excuse me," Jake said to a tall alien with 4 arms. "Can you tell me where the engineering dormitories are?" The alien looked at him with large yellow eyes. Its translator device buzzed for a moment before it spoke. "You are human, yes? 3rd corridor, section 7. Your kind stays there." The alien walked away without another word. Jake found his room after getting lost twice. The corridors all looked the same to him, filled with holographic signs in languages he could not read. When he finally reached room 347, the door slid open with a soft hiss. "You must be my new roommate," said a voice from inside. Jake entered, to see a being that looked like a cross between a lizard and a bear. The creature was about his own height, but much broader, with thick gray skin and kind golden eyes. "I'm Jake Miller," he said, setting down his backpack. "Thren of the Vulcan Republic," the alien replied. "I heard they were bringing in more humans this year. You are only the 3rd one at the academy." Jake unpacked his things while Thren watched with curiosity. When Jake pulled out his toolkit, Thren's eyes widened. "Those are very traditional tools," Thren said carefully. Jake laughed. "You mean old-fashioned?" "Yeah, I know. My grandfather gave me most of these. He was an engineer back when humans still used mechanical tools for everything." Thren picked up a simple wrench and turned it over in his large hands. "How does it work without power?" "You just turn it. The leverage does the work." Jake showed him how the wrench tightened and loosened bolts. Not everything needs computers and energy cells. The next morning, Jake attended his first engineering class. The classroom was a huge dome filled with floating workstations. Students from dozens of different species worked on projects that glowed and hummed with power. Jake found an empty station and sat down. "Look at the human," whispered a voice behind him. Jake turned to see a tall, elegant being with pale skin and silver hair. This was Vextar, a prince from the Zenthari Empire. His eyes glowed with a cold blue light as he looked at Jake's simple toolkit. "Does he plan to build starships with those primitive tools?" Vextar said loudly enough for others to hear. Several students laughed. Next to Vextar sat Quinhila, a crystalline entity whose body looked like it was made of living glass. "Perhaps humans have not yet discovered quantum engineering," she said in a voice like wind chimes. "We should not mock their limitations." Jake felt his face grow hot, but he said nothing. He had heard worse comments during his journey to the academy. Humans were new to galactic society, and most aliens saw them as primitive and backward. Professor Cathara entered the classroom, floating on a platform of pure energy. The Nexari instructor had tentacles instead of arms and skin that changed color as she spoke. "Today, we will design emergency power systems," Cathara announced. "You have 1 hour to create a device that can provide energy for life support in a crisis situation." Students around the room began pulling out devices Jake could barely understand. Holographic displays showed complex equations. Energy tools hummed to life. Molecular assemblers began building components from thin air. Jake opened his toolkit and looked at what he had: a handful of wires, some batteries, a small motor, and basic electronic components. While his classmates created devices that looked like works of art, Jake built something that looked like it belonged in a museum. When time was up, Cathara floated from station to station to examine the projects. She stopped at Vextar's workstation first. "Elegant," she said, her skin shifting to a pleased purple color. "Quantum field manipulation. Very sophisticated." She moved to Quinhila's station. "Crystalline matrix energy storage. Excellent efficiency ratings." Finally, she reached Jake's station. His device was a simple box with wires sticking out of it. Several students had gathered to watch, expecting the professor to criticize the primitive human work. Cathara studied the device carefully. She picked it up and examined the connections. "Explain how this functions," she said. "It's a basic chemical battery system connected to a mechanical generator," Jake said. "If the main power fails, you crank this handle to generate electricity. The batteries store the energy for later use. It's simple, but it works even if all the advanced systems fail." Cathara's skin shifted through several colors Jake had never seen before. "Demonstrate." Jake turned the hand crank, and a small light bulb connected to his device began to glow. The light was steady and bright. "Interesting," Cathara said. "And if electromagnetic interference disables quantum systems?" "This would still work," Jake replied. "It doesn't depend on quantum fields or advanced electronics." Cathara nodded slowly. "Reliability through simplicity, a concept many have forgotten." She floated away without saying more. After class, Jake packed up his tools while students filed out around him. He could hear whispers and laughter. Some called his work Stone Age technology. Others wondered why humans were even allowed at the academy. Thren waited for him by the door. "I thought your device was clever," he said as they walked back to their room. "Thanks," Jake replied. "My grandfather always said the best solutions are usually the simple ones." "Your grandfather sounds wise," Thren said. "Vulcan engineers build things to last forever. Sometimes simple is better than complex." That evening, Jake called his girlfriend Lisa back on Earth. Her face appeared on his communication tablet, smiling despite the time delay. "How's Space Academy?" she asked. "Different," Jake said. "The other students think humans are primitives who should still be living in caves." "Their loss," Lisa said. "You'll show them what human engineering can do." Jake smiled. "Maybe. We'll see." But as he went to sleep that night, Jake wondered if Lisa was right. Could human ingenuity really compete with technology that seemed like magic? He would find out soon enough. Professor Cathara had announced that the annual survival trial was coming, and Jake had a feeling it would test more than just engineering skills. Outside his window, the stars shone coldly in the darkness of space, waiting. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's first day at the academy. He had settled into a routine of classes, studying, and trying to ignore the whispers that followed him through the corridors. Most of his professors seemed curious about human engineering methods, but his fellow students remained convinced that Earth technology was worthless. Jake sat in the advanced survival engineering classroom, taking notes on his paper notebook, while other students recorded everything on quantum storage devices. Professor Cathara floated at the front of the room, her tentacles moving in complex patterns as she spoke. "Survival in hostile environments requires more than knowledge," Cathara said. her skin shifting to a serious deep blue. It requires adaptation, resourcefulness, and the ability to function when your technology fails you. Vextar raised his hand. Professor, surely modern technology has eliminated most survival challenges. My people have conquered hundreds of worlds using energy shields and matter converters. Overconfidence is the first step toward failure, Cathara replied. Tell me, Prince Vextar, what happens when your energy shields malfunction on a world with poisonous atmosphere? They are built with quantum redundancy systems, Vextar said confidently. Zenthari technology does not fail. Quinhala chimed in, her crystalline body ringing softly. Crystalline systems achieve 99.7% reliability across all environmental conditions. Failure is statistically irrelevant. Jake noticed that Cathara's skin had shifted to an amused yellow-green. I see. And you, Mr. Miller, what is your opinion on technological reliability? All eyes turned to Jake. He could feel the weight of their stares, expecting him to say something stupid about primitive human beliefs. Jake thought about his grandfather's lessons during camping trips back on Earth. My grandfather used to say that anything made by thinking beings can be broken by thinking beings, Jake said. Or by bad luck, bad weather, or just bad timing. He taught me to always have a backup plan that doesn't need power or computers. Several students laughed. Typical human pessimism, someone whispered. Cathara's tentacles curled in what Jake had learned was the Nexari equivalent of a smile. Wisdom often sounds like pessimism to the unprepared, which brings me to this year's announcement. The professor's platform rose higher, and holographic displays appeared around the room showing a harsh, frozen world. Students, I present Zarian 3, the site of this year's survival trial. The images showed a planet of ice and stone, swept by howling winds under a pale sun. Strange creatures moved across the frozen landscape, and aurora lights danced in the thin atmosphere. Each year, final term students must complete the survival trial to graduate, Cathara continued. You will be transported to Zarion 3 with only your personal equipment. You must survive for 72 hours, then construct a functioning beacon to signal for rescue. Jake studied the planetary data scrolling past on the displays. Average temperature was 40 degrees below freezing. Atmospheric pressure was 60% of standard. Native life forms included several large predators. Most concerning was a note about electromagnetic interference from the planet's unusual magnetic field. What kind of electromagnetic interference? Jake asked. Cathara's skin shifted to an appreciative green. An excellent question. Zarion 3's magnetic field creates powerful electromagnetic pulses during storm activity. These pulses can disable most electronic systems temporarily. Temporarily? Vexitar asked, looking less confident than before. Usually? Sometimes permanently, depending on the intensity. Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach, but not from fear. He was starting to understand why Cathara had seemed interested in his simple, non-electronic devices. After class, Jake walked back to his dormitory with Thren. His Vulcan roommate seemed unusually quiet. You are worried about the trial, Thren observed. A little, Jake admitted. You? Vulcan technology is robust, but electromagnetic pulses. Thren's thick fingers drummed against his leg. Our equipment relies on quantum processors like everyone else's. They entered their room to find Vextar waiting for them. The Zenthari prince stood by Jake's desk, examining his simple tools with obvious disdain. What do you want? Jake asked. I came to offer advice, Vextar said smoothly. The trial is dangerous. Perhaps you should withdraw before you embarrass yourself and humanity. I'll take my chances, Jake replied. With those? Vextar pointed at Jake's mechanical tools. You will die on Xerion 3 with such primitive equipment. The planet will kill you within hours. Maybe, Jake said. But at least my tools will still work when the electromagnetic pulses start. For the first time since Jake had known him, Vexatar looked uncertain. Zenthari's shields can withstand any electromagnetic interference. Can they? Jake asked. Cathara seemed to think otherwise. Vextar left without another word, but Jake noticed he looked troubled. That evening, Jake used his communication tablet to call Lisa. The quantum link took several minutes to establish, and her image flickered with static. Jake. Lisa's face appeared on the screen, smiling despite the poor connection. I was hoping you'd call. How are classes going? Good. Challenging. Jake told her about the survival trial and Xerion 3. Lisa's expression grew serious. That sounds dangerous. Are you sure you're ready for something like that? I think so. The other students all have advanced technology, but it might not work properly on that planet. My simple gear might actually be an advantage. Your grandfather's tools? Yeah. No electronics to fail, no quantum processors to malfunction, just metal and mechanical parts that work the same way everywhere. Lisa smiled. He'd be proud. Remember what he always said about camping? Prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Jake finished. I remember. Just promise me you'll be careful. I know you're tough, but this sounds really dangerous. I promise, Jake said. I'll come back home. After the call ended, Jake lay on his bed thinking about the trial. He pulled out his grandfather's survival knife and looked at it in the artificial light of the dormitory. The blade was simple steel, the handle worn smooth by years of use. No power source, no computer chips, no quantum enhancement. Just a tool that would cut what needed cutting and never break down. Jake opened his desk drawer and pulled out the letter his grandfather had given him before he left for the academy. The old man had made him promise not to read it until he faced his first real challenge. Jake thought this qualified. The letter was written in his grandfather's careful handwriting. Jake, if you're reading this, you're probably feeling like your simple tools make you weak compared to all that fancy alien technology. Don't believe it. I've seen a lot of fancy gadgets fail when things got tough. The best tool is the one that works when everything else breaks down. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and remember that humans didn't get to the stars by giving up when things looked impossible. Make me proud. Grandpa. Jake folded the letter carefully and put it back in the drawer. Through his small window, he could see other students in the dormitory across the courtyard. They were all checking their advanced equipment, running diagnostics, and updating their quantum processors. Jake picked up his simple wrench and turned it over in his hands. In a few days, they would all find out whether the future belonged to quantum technology or to the basic tools that had carried humanity from caves to the stars. He had a feeling it was going to be an interesting test. The transport ship shuddered as it entered Xerion 3's atmosphere. Jake pressed his face against the small porthole and watched the frozen landscape rush past below. The planet looked even more hostile than the classroom images had suggested. Jagged mountains of black rock pierced through endless sheets of ice, and storm clouds swirled in the pale sky. Around him, 43 other students checked their equipment one final time. The cargo hold buzzed with the sound of energy weapons, charging, quantum processors running diagnostics, and force field generators humming to life. Jake adjusted his grandfather's knife on his belt and shouldered his canvas backpack. "Final equipment check," announced Captain Zrel, the ship's Nexari commander. His tentacles moved rapidly as he consulted his instruments. "Remember, you have 72 hours to reach the extraction point and signal for pickup. The electromagnetic storms on this planet are unpredictable, so keep your communication devices protected." Vexatar stood near the front of the group, resplendent in silver armor that gleamed with built-in energy shields. His equipment pack contained fusion batteries, plasma tools, and a quantum field generator that could supposedly create shelter from pure energy. "I still say the human should not be here," Vextar said loudly. "When he dies, it will reflect poorly on the Academy," Quinhela chimed softly, her crystalline body catching the ship's lights. "Death is possible for any of us. Though I admit, mechanical tools seem inadequate for this environment." Thran checked his own gear nervously. Like most students, he carried advanced Vulcan engineering equipment, but Jake noticed his friend had also packed some basic supplies: dried food, water purification tablets, and a simple fire starter. "Smart thinking," Jake said quietly. "You are not the only one who listens to old wisdom," Thran replied. "My grandmother survived the ice wars with tools much like yours." The ship lurched suddenly, and red lights began flashing. Captain Zrel's skin shifted to an urgent orange. "Electromagnetic storm approaching faster than predicted. We need to drop you now before it hits the ship." The cargo bay doors opened with a roar of wind and snow. Below them, the frozen surface of Xerion 3 stretched out like a white wasteland. Jake could see the storm approaching on the horizon, a wall of dark clouds lit from within by strange green lightning. "Drop zones have been randomized," Captain Zrel shouted over the wind. "First group, go." Students began jumping from the transport, their anti-gravity packs carrying them safely to the surface. Jake watched Vextar descend like a silver angel, his force field protecting him from the wind and snow. "Your turn, human," the captain said when Jake reached the door. Jake looked down at the white expanse below. No anti-gravity pack, no force, field, just a simple parachute his grandfather had taught him to pack. "See you in 3 days," he said, and jumped. The wind hit him like a frozen hammer. Snow stung his face as he fell toward the surface, counting seconds until he pulled his ripcord. The parachute opened with a jerk that knocked the wind out of him, but it held. Jake guided himself toward a relatively flat area between two rocky ridges. He hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through his shoulder, but nothing felt broken. Jake quickly gathered his parachute before the wind could catch it, then looked around to get his bearings. The storm was moving fast. Jake could already feel the static electricity in the air, making his skin tingle. In the distance, he could see other students landing, their advanced equipment glowing against the white landscape. Then the storm hit. The electromagnetic pulse rolled across the planet like an invisible wave. Jake felt it pass through him, a strange sensation like being touched by lightning without the pain. All around him, the lights from other students' equipment began flickering and going out. Jake pulled out his simple compass and checked his direction. The extraction point was 20 kilometers south past a series of rocky hills. He started walking, his boots crunching in the snow. After an hour of steady hiking, Jake heard shouting ahead. He climbed a small ridge and saw Vextar standing over his equipment pack, frantically pressing buttons on devices that no longer responded. The Zenthari Prince's silver armor had lost its glow, and his force field generator sparked uselessly. "In the snow! Work!" Vexatar shouted at his quantum field generator. "I command you to work!" Nearby, Quinhella sat motionless in the snow, her crystalline body dim and lifeless. Jake hurried over to check on her, worried she might be dead. "Quinhella?" he called. The crystalline entity stirred slowly. "Systems compromised. Quantum matrix damaged by electromagnetic interference. Are you hurt? Processors running at 12% capacity. Unable to regulate body temperature effectively." Jake looked around and saw other students scattered across the landscape, all struggling with failing equipment. Some were panicking, pressing buttons on dead devices. Others sat in the snow, looking lost and confused. The temperature was dropping quickly as the pale sun moved toward the horizon. Without their energy shields and heating systems, most of the students would freeze before morning. Jake made a decision. He climbed onto a tall rock and shouted as loud as he could. "Hey! Everyone who can hear me, come here!" Slowly, students began gathering around the base of the rock. They looked at Jake with expressions ranging from desperation to skepticism. "Your equipment isn't working," Jake said. "Mine is. If you want to survive the night, you need to listen to me." "Listen to the primitive human?" Vextar snarled, though Jake noticed the prince was shivering in his powerless armor. "I would rather die with honor." "You might get that chance," Jake replied, "but the rest of you don't have to. First thing we need is shelter from the wind." Jake jumped down from the rock and began gathering loose stones. "We're going to build a windbreak, then start a fire. It's basic survival. Nothing fancy." Thren immediately began helping, using his strength to move larger rocks. After a moment, Quinhella slowly joined them, her movements stiff but determined. "This is madness," Vextar said. "Stacking rocks like savages." "Then freeze," Jake replied without looking up. "No one's forcing you to help." As Jake worked, he pulled out his flint and steel, dry tinder, and other simple tools. Students watched in fascination as he built a fire using methods that predated space travel by thousands of years. The flames caught and began to grow, throwing orange light across the snow. The warmth felt wonderful after hours in the freezing wind. "How?" asked a snake-like student from the Sethri collective. "How do you make fire without plasma ignition?" Jake showed them the flint and steel, explaining how the sparks caught the tinder. More students began gathering around the fire, drawn by the warmth and light. "This is the most primitive thing I have ever seen," muttered an insectoid student, but he moved closer to the flames. As night fell completely, Jake organized the group into shifts to keep the fire burning. He showed them how to find dry wood, among the debris scattered across the landscape, and how to arrange stones to reflect heat back toward their sleeping area. Vextar finally approached the fire, his pride apparently less important than freezing to death. "I suppose even primitive methods have their place," he said stiffly. "Just survival," Jake replied. "Nothing primitive about staying alive." As the students settled down for the night, Jake looked up at the alien stars wheeling overhead. Somewhere, up there, the transport ship was waiting to pick them up in 2 days. But first, they had to survive what Zarion 3 could throw at them. The fire crackled peacefully in the darkness, a small bubble of warmth and light in the frozen wasteland. Jake smiled as he remembered his grandfather's words. "The simplest solutions are usually the best ones." He had a feeling they were going to need every simple solution he could think of. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of something large moving through the snow. He lay still for a moment, listening carefully to the rhythmic crunch of footsteps that were definitely not made by any of the students. The fire had burned down to glowing coals during the night. Around him, 32 students slept huddled together for warmth. Their advanced equipment lay scattered and useless in the snow, dead metal and plastic that had promised so much and delivered nothing when it mattered. The footsteps were getting closer. Jake slowly reached for his grandfather's knife and eased himself away from the sleeping group. He could see tracks in the snow now, huge paw prints with 6 toes and deep claw marks. Whatever made them was big, and it was circling their camp. A low growl echoed through the pre-dawn darkness. Jake had read about Xerion 3's predators in the mission briefing. Frost stalkers were the planet's apex hunters, massive 6-legged creatures that looked like a cross between a wolf and a bear. They hunted in packs and were attracted to heat and movement. The growl came again, closer this time. Jake could see a pair of glowing yellow eyes watching them from behind a boulder. "Thren," Jake whispered urgently. "Thren, wake up." His Volcan roommate stirred and opened his golden eyes. When he saw Jake's tense posture and drawn knife, Thren became instantly alert. "What is it?" Thren whispered. "Frost stalkers. At least one, maybe more." Thren's thick hide turned pale. "What do we do?" Jake thought quickly. The students had no working weapons except for his knife and whatever improvised tools they could make. The creatures were too big and dangerous to fight directly, but running in the snow would be suicide. "Wake the others quietly," Jake said. "No sudden movements." As Thren carefully roused the other students, Jake studied the creature watching them. It was massive, easily 3 meters long, with thick white fur and muscles that rippled under its coat. Its 6 legs ended in paws the size of dinner plates, equipped with claws that could probably tear through metal. The students woke to find themselves being stalked by something that could kill them all without breaking stride. Several started to panic. "Quiet," Jake ordered. "Movement attracts them. Stay calm." "Easy for you to say," hissed Vextar. "Your people probably lived with such beasts. The rest of us are civilized." "Civilized or not, those claws don't care," Jake replied. "Listen carefully. These things hunt by ambush. They're waiting for us to run so they can chase us down." Quinhella's crystalline body was still functioning at reduced capacity, but her voice chimed clearly. "Suggest retreat to defensive position." "Where?" asked the snake-like Sethri student. "There is nowhere to run on this frozen waste." Jake looked around and spotted what he needed. "Those rocks over there form a natural choke point. If we can get there, they can only come at us from one direction." The frost stalker stepped out from behind its boulder, revealing its full size. It was even bigger than Jake had thought, with a mouth full of teeth that gleamed in the starlight. Worse, he could see more eyes glowing in the darkness behind it. "There are at least 4 of them," Jake said quietly. "We move together, slowly. No running, no sudden movements. Pick up anything. That could be used as a weapon." The students began gathering rocks, broken pieces of equipment, anything with weight or a sharp edge. Jake noticed that even Vexistar had abandoned his pride enough to arm himself with a jagged piece of his broken force field generator. They started moving toward the rocky outcropping, a slow, careful procession across the snow. The frost stalkers followed, staying just outside of throwing range, but close enough to pounce if anyone ran. Halfway to the rocks, one of the creatures lost patience. It charged with a roar that echoed off the mountains, 6 legs driving it across the snow faster than anything that large should be able to move. Jake saw it coming straight at Thren, who had fallen slightly behind the group. Without thinking, Jake threw himself sideways, tackling his roommate and rolling them both out of the creature's path. The frost stalker's claws raked the air where Thren had been standing, missing by centimeters. "Run!" Jake shouted, abandoning stealth for speed. The student sprinted for the rocks as the pack of frost stalkers howled and gave chase. Jake helped Thren to his feet and pushed him toward safety, then turned to face the nearest predator with his knife ready. The creature was massive up close, its breath steaming in the cold air as it bared teeth like daggers. Jake knew he had no chance in a direct fight, but he didn't need to win. He just needed to buy time for the others to reach safety. The frost stalker lunged at him. Jake dove to the side and slashed with his knife, the steel blade finding a gap in the creature's thick fur. The cut wasn't deep, but it drew blood and made the beast angry. "Jake!" Thren shouted from the rocks. "This way!" Jake ran for the safety of the stone outcropping with the wounded frost stalker right behind him. He could feel its hot breath on his neck as massive claws swiped at his back. He dove between two large boulders just as the creature pounced. Its claws scraped against stone instead of flesh, and Jake rolled to safety behind the rock barrier. The frost stalkers circled the outcropping, snarling and testing for weaknesses. But the rocks formed a natural fortress with only one narrow entrance, and the students had managed to block that with loose stones. "We made it," gasped an insectoid student. "We are safe. For now," Jake said, watching the predators pace back and forth. But they're not giving up. Vextar examined the improvised barricade with professional interest. "These rocks will not hold against a determined assault." "They don't have to hold forever," Jake replied. "Just until we figure out how to drive them off." Quinhella's crystalline form chimed thoughtfully. "Frost stalkers are ambush predators. They prefer easy prey. If we appear too dangerous, they may seek other targets." "How do we appear dangerous with broken equipment and a few rocks?" asked the Sethri student. Jake looked at the materials they had available. Broken technology, loose stones, his grandfather's knife, and some basic supplies. Not much to work with, but his grandfather had taught him that the best weapons were often improvised ones. "We make spears," Jake said. "Long, sharp sticks that keep those claws away from us. And we work together. Alone, each of us is prey. Together, we're a threat." Over the next hour, Jake showed the students how to lash broken equipment to metal rods, creating crude but effective spear points. He taught them basic tactics: how to stand together, how to thrust and withdraw, how to protect each other's flanks. The frost stalkers watched from a distance, perhaps sensing that their easy prey had become something more dangerous. When the sun finally rose over the mountains, painting the snow pink and gold, the pack of predators melted away into the landscape. They would be back, Jake knew. But for now the students were safe. "That was incredible," Thren said, examining his improvised spear. "I never knew such simple weapons could be effective." "Tools are only as good as the person using them," Jake replied, "and the person standing next to them." Even Vextar looked impressed, though he tried to hide it. "Perhaps human methods have some merit after all." Jake smiled as he watched the other students practice with their improvised weapons. They were learning that survival wasn't about having the best technology. It was about adapting, working together, and never giving up. They still had 2 days to reach the extraction point, and Jake suspected the frost stalkers weren't the only danger waiting for them on Zerion 3. But for the first time since landing on this frozen world, he felt confident they could make it. His grandfather would have been proud. The morning sun brought little warmth to Zerion 3's frozen landscape. Jake stood at the edge of their rocky shelter, studying the terrain between them and the extraction point. 15 kilometers of ice and stone stretched ahead, broken by deep valleys and steep ridges that would be treacherous to cross. Behind him, the surviving students prepared for the day's journey. They had lost 11 members during the night, some to the cold when their heating systems failed, others to smaller predators that had found them scattered and alone. The 32 who remained had learned to listen when Jake spoke. "We need water," Jake announced, turning back to the group. "The snow here is safe to melt, but we need containers and a way to purify it." Quinhella held up a piece of her damaged crystalline matrix. "This section can store liquids, though the quantum filtration system is non-functional." "We don't need quantum filtration," Jake said. He pulled a small packet from his backpack. "Water purification tablets. Drop one in melted snow, wait 10 minutes. Safe to drink." The insectoid student, whose name Jake had learned was Clicks, chittered in amazement. "Such simple chemistry, my people would use molecular reorganization to achieve the same result." "Sometimes simple is better," Jake replied. "These tablets work without power, can't break down, and weigh almost nothing." Thren had been working on something near the fire. "Jake, look at this." He held up a crude but functional water container, made from a piece of metal sheeting, carefully bent and sealed with a substance from his emergency kit. "Perfect," Jake said. "Can you make more?" "Several. My people are good with metal work." As they worked, Vextar approached Jake with what looked like painful reluctance. "Human, I must ask, your methods for starting fires, could you teach them to others?" Jake looked at the Zenthari prince with surprise. "I thought you said my methods were primitive." "They are primitive," Vextar said stiffly, "but they function when advanced technology fails. A good leader adapts to circumstances." Jake spent the next hour teaching interested students how to use flint and steel, how to prepare tinder, and how to build fires that would burn efficiently. Even proud species like the Zenthari and crystallines paid attention, recognizing that their survival might depend on these ancient skills. When they finally set out across the ice, the group moved like a small army. Jake had organized them into a formation that protected the weakest members while keeping the strongest on the outside where they could respond to threats. Everyone carried an improvised weapon and basic supplies. The first few kilometers went smoothly. The snow was deep but manageable, and the rocky terrain provided decent footing. Jake led them along a route that avoided the worst of the wind, while staying clear of areas that looked like good ambush sites. But as they climbed toward a pass between two peaks, Click suddenly stopped and raised his antennae. "I sense vibrations in the ice. Something large is moving beneath us." Jake called for a halt and knelt to press his ear against the snow. Deep below, he could hear a rhythmic thumping, like massive footsteps in underground caverns. "Ice burrowers," said a student. Jake didn't recognize one of the few remaining from species he'd never encountered before. "My home world has similar creatures. They hunt by feeling vibrations through ice and stone." "How big?" Jake asked. "Large enough to swallow a transport ship." Jake looked around at the terrain. They were on a ridge between two valleys, with steep slopes on either side. If something that large broke through the ice beneath them, they would all fall into whatever hole it created. "We need to get off this ridge," Jake said. Quietly and quickly, they began moving toward the nearest solid ground, but before they had gone 50 meters, the ice beneath their feet began to crack. "Run!" Jake shouted. The students scattered as a section of ridge collapsed behind them. Through the hole came something that looked like a cross between a whale and a centipede, easily 20 meters long with rows of grinding teeth. The ice burrower pulled itself partially out of its tunnel and swiveled a massive head toward the fleeing students. Most of the group made it to safety on solid rock, but 3 students found themselves cut off on a section of collapsing ice. One was Vexistar, his silver armor making him an easy target as he struggled to reach stable ground. Without thinking, Jake grabbed a coil of rope from his pack and tied one end around a large boulder. "Thren, anchor this!" He threw the other end toward the stranded students. "Grab the rope!" The ice burrower lunged toward Vextar with rows of teeth spinning like circular saws. The Zenthari prince caught the rope just as the ice beneath him gave way completely. Jake and several other students hauled him to safety as the creature's jaws snapped shut on empty air. The other 2 students weren't as lucky. The ice burrower's massive bulk shifted, and they disappeared into the dark tunnel, below with screams that echoed off the mountain walls. For a moment, everyone stood in shocked silence. Then the ice burrower sank back into its tunnel and the mountain was quiet again except for the wind. "Thank you," Vextar said quietly. He looked shaken by how close he had come to death. "I owe you my life." "We look out for each other," Jake replied. "That's how we all make it home." As they continued across the mountains, Jake noticed changes in how the students interacted with each other and with him. Species that had barely spoken before were sharing supplies and working together. Students who had mocked human primitiveness now asked Jake's advice on everything from route selection to equipment improvisation. When they stopped for a rest near midday, Quinhala approached him with what passed for curiosity in her crystalline features. "Your leadership methods are interesting," she chimed. "You do not command through superior technology or inherited authority." "I lead by example," Jake said. "My grandfather taught me that people follow someone they trust, not someone they fear." Yet Vexitar is a prince of the Zenthari Empire. Clix commands respect among the Sethri collective. Why do they follow a human with primitive tools? Jake considered the question while he checked his compass and map. "Because my tools work, and because I know how to use them. When people are scared and their technology fails, they want someone who can actually solve problems." "Is that why you shared your knowledge freely? You could have kept the fire-making techniques secret, maintained your advantage." "What advantage?" Jake asked. "If half the group freezes to death because they can't make fire, then we all become weaker. The Froststalkers will pick us off one by one. Survival isn't about being better than everyone else. It's about making sure everyone survives." Quinhela's crystalline form sparkled in the sunlight. "Your species thinks differently than mine. Crystallines value individual perfection over group cooperation. And how's that working out for you here?" "Not well," she admitted. "Perhaps there is wisdom in human methods after all." That afternoon, they encountered their biggest challenge yet. The pass they needed to cross was blocked by an avalanche, forcing them to choose between a dangerous detour through predator territory or an even more dangerous climb over unstable ice fields. Jake studied both options while the group waited. Both routes were risky, but the ice fields offered better visibility and fewer places for predators to hide. "We go over the ice," he decided. "But we rope together and move carefully. If someone falls through, the rest of us can pull them out." It took them 3 hours to cross the ice fields, moving step by careful step with makeshift crampons Jake had taught them to fashion from broken equipment. They had 2 close calls with hidden crevasses, but each time the rope system saved whoever fell through. When they finally reached solid ground on the far side, even Jake felt exhausted. But they had made good progress toward the extraction point, and more importantly, they had worked together as a team. As they set up camp for their second night on Xerion 3, Jake noticed storm clouds gathering on the horizon. This storm looked different from the electromagnetic pulse that had disabled their equipment. This one promised snow, wind, and temperatures that could kill them all. "We need better shelter tonight," Jake announced. "Tomorrow's storm is going to be worse than anything we've faced so far." The students looked at the approaching clouds with fear, but also with determination. They had learned that they could survive anything if they worked together and followed someone who knew what he was doing. Jake smiled as he watched them begin gathering materials for an improved shelter. They were no longer the pampered, technology-dependent students who had arrived on Xerion 3. They were becoming something harder and more capable. They were becoming survivors. The storm hit just after midnight with a fury that made their previous challenges seem like gentle breezes. Jake woke to the sound of wind that screamed like a living thing, driving snow so hard it felt like frozen needles against any exposed skin. Their improved shelter was holding, but barely. Jake had taught the students to build a proper windbreak using principles his grandfather had learned from Arctic survival guides. Layers of stone and salvaged metal created walls that deflected the worst of the wind, while a carefully designed interior trapped body heat and kept the fire burning despite the gale outside. 29 students huddled around the central fire pit. They had lost 3 more during the day's journey. 1 to exhaustion, 2 to a hidden ice crevasse that had opened without warning. Each loss hit the group harder, but also brought them closer together. The electromagnetic interference is getting stronger, Quinhella reported, her crystalline form flickering with unstable energy patterns. "My remaining systems detect massive electrical activity in the storm clouds." Jake nodded grimly. He had noticed the static electricity building up throughout the day. Their metal tools were conducting small shocks, and everyone's hair stood up despite the humid air from their breath and the fire. "Another pulse is coming," he warned. "Anything electronic that survived the first one might not make it through this." Vexitar held up his communication device, one of the few pieces of technology still partially functional. "This contains our only link to the extraction coordinates. If it fails, then we navigate by dead reckoning and hope we find the right valley," Jake finished. "Do you have a backup?" "Zenthari technology does not require backups," Vexitar said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Jake pulled out his paper map and compass, spreading them on the shelter floor where the firelight could illuminate them. "Then we better make sure we know where we're going without it." The electromagnetic pulse hit 20 minutes later. It felt stronger than the first one, a wave of invisible energy that made everyone's teeth ache and left the taste of copper in their mouths. Vexitar's communication device sparked once and went dark forever. "Now we are truly alone," whispered Clicks, his antennae drooping with despair. "No," Jake said firmly. "We have each other. We have our skills. We have everything we need to make it to the extraction point." But even as he spoke, Jake could hear something else in the wind. A howling that wasn't quite natural, coming from multiple directions at once. The frost stalkers had found them again, and this time they had brought friends. Through gaps in their shelter walls, Jake could see eyes glowing in the darkness, dozens of them, circling their position like yellow stars in the storm. The pack had grown larger, drawn by the scent of prey trapped by the weather. "They are waiting for the storm to weaken us," observed a new student, one of the few remaining from a species Jake didn't recognize. When we are too tired to fight, they will attack. Jake counted the eyes he could see. At least 20 frost stalkers, maybe more hidden in the blowing snow. Their improvised weapons and crude tactics had worked against 4 predators, but 20 was an entirely different problem. We can't fight that many, Thren said quietly. Even with spears and teamwork, they will overwhelm us. Jake studied their situation. The shelter was defensible from 1 or 2 directions, but the frost stalkers could attack from all sides at once. The storm would last for hours, wearing down the students' strength and resolve. By morning, they would be easy prey, unless they changed the game entirely. "We're not going to fight them," Jake announced. "We're going to make them not want to fight us." "How?" asked Vextar. Jake pointed to their fire. "Fire is the one thing every predator fears. We're going to give them more fire than they've ever seen." Over the next hour, Jake organized the students into work teams. Some gathered every piece of flammable material they could find: broken equipment, fabric, dried vegetation blown in by the wind. Others prepared crude torches using metal, rods, and improvised fuel. The most dangerous job went to Jake himself. He crawled to the edge of their shelter and began placing small fires around their perimeter, each one carefully positioned to create a ring of flames that would keep the frost stalkers at bay. The wind made the work treacherous. Twice, Jake nearly set himself on fire when gusts blew flames back toward him. Once he came face to face with a frost stalker that had crept too close, its massive head only meters away. But Jake held steady, using his grandfather's knife to cut a torch free from his belt and thrust it toward the creature's face. The frost stalker backed away with a snarl, its eyes reflecting the dancing flames. When Jake returned to the shelter, his eyebrows were singed and his hands were shaking from cold and adrenaline. But the ring of fires was complete. The frost stalkers paced outside the flames, clearly frustrated but unwilling to cross the barrier of light and heat. "Brilliant," breathed Quinhila. "You have created a perimeter they cannot breach." "For now," Jake said. "But we need to keep those fires burning all night. That means constant fuel gathering and maintenance. Everyone takes shifts." The rest of the night passed in a blur of activity. Students took turns feeding the perimeter fires while others rested and prepared for the next day's journey. The frost stalkers remained outside their ring of flames, occasionally testing for weaknesses but never finding any. As dawn approached, Jake realized they had another problem. The storm was weakening, but it had dumped enormous amounts of snow around their shelter. They were effectively buried in a white bowl, with steep walls on all sides. "We're trapped," said Clicks, his antennae twitching nervously. "Even if the frost stalkers leave, we cannot climb out." Jake examined the snow walls surrounding them. They were at least 3 meters high and looked unstable. Any attempt to climb them might trigger an avalanche that would bury them all. But there was another option. "We dig," Jake announced. "Not up, but out. A tunnel through the base of the snow wall." "That will take hours," protested Vextar. "And what if it collapses?" "Then we shore it up as we go," Jake replied. "My grandfather worked in mining before he became an engineer. He taught me how to dig safe tunnels." The work was exhausting. Students took turns digging with improvised tools, while others carried away snow and debris. Jake directed the tunnel's construction, teaching them how to recognize dangerous overhead and how to place supports to prevent collapse. It took 4 hours to dig a tunnel long enough to reach solid ground beyond the snow walls. When they finally emerged, blinking in the pale sunlight, They found the frost stalkers had given up and moved on to easier prey. But their troubles weren't over. The storm had blown them off course, and the extraction point was now a full day's journey through terrain that looked even more treacherous than what they had already crossed. Worse, Jake could see in the distance the dark shapes of more predators. Not frost stalkers this time, but something that moved through the snow like sharks through water. Ice worms, according to his briefing materials. Creatures that could burrow through frozen ground as easily as fish swam through water. "Can we avoid them?" asked Threnda. Jake studied the terrain between them and their destination. The ice worms controlled the most direct route, but going around them would add another day to their journey. They were already running low on food and fuel, and another night in the open might kill them. No, Jake decided. We go through. But we go together, and we go fast. As they prepared for what might be their final push to safety, Jake noticed something that made him proud, despite their desperate situation. The students were no longer the scared, technology-dependent individuals who had landed on Zarian 3 days ago. They moved with purpose, shared resources without being asked, and looked to each other for support. They had become a team. More than that, they had become a family. "Ready?" Jake asked. 29 voices answered as one. "Ready?" Together, they set out across the ice toward whatever dangers waited ahead. They would face them as they had faced everything else on this frozen world, together, with simple tools and human determination. Behind them, the flames of their perimeter. Fires still burned against the white snow, a testament to the power of basic human ingenuity in the face of impossible odds. The ice worms struck without warning. Jake was leading the group across what looked like solid ground when the snow beneath his feet suddenly exploded upward. A creature like a giant metallic worm erupted from below, its circular mouth lined with spinning teeth designed to chew through frozen earth. "Scatter!" Jake shouted, diving sideways as the ice worm's jaws snapped shut where he had been standing. The students spread out across the snow as more worms burst from the ground around them. These creatures were different from the frost stalkers. Faster, more aggressive, and completely without fear of fire or noise. They seemed to hunt by vibration, tracking movement through the ice like seismic sensors. Jake rolled to his feet and drew his grandfather's knife, though he knew the small blade would be useless against something 30 meters long. Around him, the other students scrambled for weapons and tried to avoid the snapping jaws that emerged from the snow like deadly flowers. "They hunt by movement," Jake called out. "Everyone stop moving!" The students froze in place, some balanced awkwardly on one foot where they had been caught mid-step. For a moment, the area became eerily quiet, except for the wind. The ice worms slowed their attacks, their eyeless heads weaving back and forth, as they searched for prey. But staying motionless was only a temporary solution. Jake could see that several students were trapped in bad positions. Clix was balanced on a slope where he couldn't maintain his stance much longer, and one of the younger students was standing directly over a hole where an ice worm had just disappeared back underground. Jake needed a plan, and he needed it fast. He remembered something from his grandfather's mining stories. Underground creatures that hunted by vibration could be confused by multiple sources of movement, especially if those sources created conflicting signals. "When I give the signal," Jake called out quietly, "everyone stamp your feet 3 times, then run for those rocks over there. Create as much noise and vibration as possible." "That will attract them all to us," protested Vextar. "Exactly," Jake replied. "But if we all make noise at once, they won't know which target to attack first." Jake counted down from 3, then shouted, "Now!" 29 students began stamping, jumping, and shouting as they ran toward a cluster of large boulders that offered the only solid shelter in sight. The effect on the ice worms was immediate and chaotic. They burst from the snow in all directions, their primitive hunting instincts overloaded by too many targets moving at once. Most of the students made it to the rocks safely, but Quinhela fell behind, her crystalline body damaged by the electromagnetic pulses, couldn't move as quickly as the others. An ice worm erupted directly in front of her, its spinning teeth reaching for her fragile form. Jake didn't think. He grabbed a heavy rock and hurled it at the creature's head, shouting at the top of his lungs to draw its attention. The ice worm turned toward him instead of Quinhela, giving her the seconds she needed to reach safety. But now Jake was alone on the open snow with an angry ice worm bearing down on him. The creature lunged forward, its jaws wide enough to swallow him whole. Jake dove between its teeth and rolled underneath its body, slashing upward with his knife as he passed. The blade found something vital, and the ice worm convulsed in pain before collapsing motionless in the snow. Jake scrambled out from under the dead creature and ran for the rocks, where the other students waited with expressions of amazement and fear. "How did you know to do that?" asked Thren. "I didn't," Jake admitted, breathing hard. "I just hoped the knife would find something important." But their victory was short-lived. More ice worms were emerging from the snow around their rocky shelter, and this time they seemed to have learned from their packmate's death. Instead of attacking immediately, they began circling the rocks, waiting for the students to make a mistake. "We're trapped," said the insectoid Clix. "They will wait until we starve or freeze." Jake studied their situation. The rocks provided good protection, but they weren't large enough to shelter all 29 students indefinitely. They had some food left, but not enough for a long siege, and the temperature was dropping again as evening approached. Worse, Jake could see that Quinhela was failing. The damage to her crystalline matrix was spreading, and she was moving more slowly with each passing hour. If they didn't reach the extraction point soon, she wouldn't survive another night in the cold. "We can't wait them out," Jake decided. "We have to fight our way through." "Fight?" Vexatar looked at the ice worms circling their position. "With what?" "Your knife killed one, but there are at least a dozen out there." Jake looked at the resources they had available. Broken equipment, salvaged metal, rope, and the knowledge his grandfather had passed down about fighting when the odds were impossible. "We make the fight unfair," Jake said. "My grandfather told me about something called asymmetric warfare. When you can't win by fighting fairly, you change the rules." Over the next hour, Jake organized the students into what he privately thought of as the most unusual military unit in galactic history. Using principles of guerrilla tactics that humans had developed over thousands of years, he taught them how to turn their weaknesses into strengths. The plan was risky, but it was their only chance. As the sun set over Zarion 3, Jake gave the signal. Half the students began throwing rocks and broken equipment in one direction, creating noise and distraction. The ice worms immediately converged on the apparent threat, just as Jake had hoped. While the creatures were focused on the decoy, the other half of the students crept out from the opposite side of their shelter. Jake led them in a wide circle around the distracted ice worms, moving carefully to avoid creating vibrations that would give them away. When they were in position behind, "The creatures!" Jake signaled the attack. It wasn't a fair fight, and that was exactly the point. The students attacked the ice worms from behind with improvised spears and clubs, targeting the creatures' vulnerable spots while they were distracted by the decoy. The worms tried to turn and defend themselves, but they were designed for hunting individual prey, not fighting organized groups. The battle was brutal and desperate. Jake lost track of time as he dodged snapping jaws and thrust his knife at anything that moved toward his friends. Students fell and were dragged to safety by their teammates. Blood stained the snow red as both sides fought with everything they had. When it was over, half the ice worms lay dead in the snow. The survivors had retreated underground, apparently deciding that these particular prey items were more trouble than they were worth. Jake counted his people and felt his heart sink. They had lost 4 more students in the fight, including Brave, Clicks, who had sacrificed himself to save 2 younger classmates. 25 survivors remained, many of them wounded and all of them exhausted. But Quinhela was still alive, though her crystalline form was barely functional. And in the distance, Jake could see their destination, a valley marked on his grandfather's compass where the extraction ship would be waiting. "Can you make it?" Jake asked Quinhela. "Unknown," she chimed weakly. "Systems failing. But I will. Try." Vextar approached Jake with something that might have been respect. "Your tactics were effective. Where did humans learn to fight like that?" "From necessity," Jake replied. "My people have been fighting impossible odds for our entire history. We learned that sometimes the only way to survive is to refuse to give up." As they prepared for the final push to the extraction point, Jake looked around at the faces of his surviving classmates. They were dirty, tired, and scared, but they were also something else, something they hadn't been when they first landed on Zerion 3. They were warriors. Each and every one of them had faced death and chosen to fight instead of surrender. They had learned that survival wasn't about having the best technology or the most advanced equipment. It was about having the courage to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. "Ready for the last stretch?" Jake asked. 25 voices answered as one, weaker than before but no less determined. "Ready?" Together they set out for the extraction point, carrying their wounded and supporting each other across the frozen landscape. Behind them, the battlefield was silent, except for the wind blowing across the snow. They had 1 more day to reach safety. Jake intended to make sure all 25 of them made it home. The extraction point lay in a valley carved between 2 mountain ridges, marked by ancient rock formations that stood like silent sentinels against the pale sky. Jake crouched on the ridge above, studying the landing zone through the scope he had improvised from broken equipment lenses. Below them stretched a flat area perfect for a rescue ship to land, but it was also perfect for an ambush. Jake could see movement in the shadows between the rocks. More frost stalkers, drawn by the scent of wounded prey. "How many?" asked Thren, lying beside him in the snow. "At least 30, Jake replied grimly. "Maybe more. They know we have to. Come down there." Behind them, the remaining 24 students waited among the rocks. They had lost 1 more during the night march. A brave student who had insisted he could keep walking until he simply collapsed and never got up again. Quinhela was barely conscious, her crystalline form dim and cracked. Several others were wounded from the ice worm battle and could barely walk, but they were less than 200 meters from safety. The extraction window opened in 6 hours, and the rescue ship would wait for exactly 30 minutes before leaving forever. If they could reach the landing zone and signal for pickup, they would all go home. The only problem was getting past 30 hungry predators with 24 exhausted students. half of whom could barely stand. Jake studied the valley one more time, then slid back to where the others waited. "We have a problem," he announced. "The landing zone is crawling with frost stalkers. We can't fight our way through, and we can't wait them out." "So what do we do?" asked Vextar. The Zenthari. Prince looked nothing like the arrogant noble who had mocked Jake's primitive tools 3 days ago. His silver armor was dented and stained. His face was haggard with exhaustion, but his eyes still held determination. Jake pulled out his grandfather's knife and looked at it in the pale sunlight. The blade was nicked and stained from their battles, but it had never failed him. Just like the other simple tools that had kept them alive when all the advanced technology had failed. "We build a beacon," Jake said. "Not the kind the Academy expects, but one that will work." He pulled out the mission briefing and spread it on the snow. "The rescue ship is equipped with broad-spectrum sensors. They're looking for any kind of electromagnetic signal from the landing zone. It doesn't have to be a quantum transmitter or a crystalline matrix broadcaster." "What are you thinking?" asked Quinhela weakly. Jake smiled and pulled out a coil of copper wire, some batteries, and his grandfather's old radio components. "I'm thinking about something my grandfather taught me when I was 10 years old. How to build a radio transmitter from spare parts." For the next 3 hours, Jake worked with an intensity that impressed even the alien students who had once mocked his primitive methods. He stripped copper wire from damaged equipment, connected batteries in series to boost power, and used principles of electromagnetic transmission that humans had discovered centuries before faster-than-light travel. The other students helped however they could, following Jake's instructions even when they didn't understand the theory behind them. Thren used his strength to bend metal components into the right shapes. Vextar contributed rare earth elements from his damaged armor to improve the antenna's conductivity. Even failing Quinhela offered fragments of her crystalline matrix to serve as frequency modulators. "Will it work?" asked a student whose name Jake had never learned, one of the quiet ones who had somehow survived when louder, more confident classmates had fallen. "It should," Jake said, making final adjustments to the antenna array he had built from salvaged parts. "Radio waves are radio waves, whether they come from quantum processors or old-fashioned electronics. The rescue ship's sensors should detect the signal. But they still had to get the beacon to the landing zone, and that meant dealing with the frost stalkers." Jake studied the valley again, this time looking for tactical advantages rather than threats. The predators were positioned to intercept anyone coming down the obvious paths, but they had made one mistake. They were thinking like hunters, not like soldiers. "Here's what we're going to do," Jake announced. "We're going to give them exactly what they expect to see." The plan was the most audacious thing Jake had ever attempted. Using every principle of misdirection and asymmetric warfare his grandfather had taught him, he divided the students into 3 groups. The first group, led by Vextar, would create a massive distraction on the east side of the valley. They would make noise, throw rocks, and generally convince the frost stalkers that the main force was attacking from that direction. The second group, led by Thren, would position themselves on the west side and wait for Jake's signal. When the predators moved to intercept the first group, the second group would charge down the slope and engage them in direct combat. Meanwhile, Jake would take the beacon and 2 volunteers down the center path, moving fast and quiet, while the frost stalkers were distracted by the battles on their flanks. "This is insane," muttered one of the students. "You're asking us to fight 30 frost stalkers with broken tools and improvised weapons." "No," Jake replied. "I'm asking you to keep them busy for 10 minutes while I get the beacon into position. That's all we need. 10 minutes. Quinhela's Voice chimed weakly from where she lay propped against a rock. I cannot fight, but I can assist with the beacon. My remaining matrix fragments can amplify the signal. You're too weak, Jake protested. I am dying anyway, she replied matter-of-factly. Let me die doing something useful. Jake looked around at the faces of his classmates, aliens from dozens of different worlds who had learned to work together in the face of impossible odds. 3 days ago, they had been strangers united only by their shared enrollment at the academy. Now they were family, bound together by shared struggle and mutual sacrifice. All right, Jake said. We do this together, on my signal. The battle for the extraction point began just as the sun reached its zenith. Vexatar's group attacked first, charging down the eastern slope with war cries that echoed off the mountain walls. The Frost Stalkers immediately converged on them, just as Jake had hoped. When half the Predators were engaged with Vextar's team, Thren led his group down the western slope. The remaining Frost Stalkers found themselves caught between two forces, forced to split their attention between multiple threats. In the chaos of battle, Jake and Quinhela slipped down the central path toward the landing zone. Her crystalline form was failing rapidly, but she managed to keep moving through sheer force of will. They reached the center of the landing zone just as Jake's improvised timer indicated they had 5 minutes until the extraction window opened. Jake quickly set up the beacon while Quinhela integrated her matrix fragments into the antenna array. Signal strength is acceptable, she chimed weakly. The rescue ship should detect us when it enters sensor range. Jake activated the beacon and watched with satisfaction as crude but functional electromagnetic waves began broadcasting their location to anyone listening. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't sophisticated, but it would work. Above them, a Frost Stalker broke through the battle lines and charged straight for the beacon. Jake grabbed his grandfather's knife and prepared to make his last stand, but Vextar appeared from nowhere and tackled the creature sideways, both of them rolling away from the critical equipment. The Zenthari prince fought the predator hand-to-hand, his royal training finally proving useful for something other than ceremony. When it was over, Vexatar stood bleeding but victorious over the dead Frost Stalker. I told you Zenthari technology does not fail, he gasped. Though I admit, sometimes old-fashioned courage works better than energy shields. The rescue ship appeared over the mountain ridge exactly on schedule, its sensors immediately locking onto Jake's primitive but effective beacon. As it descended toward the landing zone, the remaining Frost Stalkers scattered into the rocks, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. 24 students limped aboard the rescue ship, carrying Quinhela between them. Her crystalline form had gone completely dark, but Jake could feel a faint vibration that meant she was still alive. Captain Zrel met them at the airlock, his Nexari features showing amazement at their condition. Incredible. We detected 43 students initially. I expected to recover perhaps a dozen survivors. We had good leadership, Vextar said, looking directly at Jake. And we learned that the best technology is worthless without the wisdom to use it properly.